Most people don't fail at intermittent fasting because fasting doesn't work. They fail because they misunderstand what fasting is supposed to do in the first place. Before the body ever burns fat, before hunger quiets down, before energy stabilizes, something much more fundamental has to happen. The body has to reinterpret safety, and that is the step almost no one talks about. Intermittent fasting is often presented as a shortcut. Skip breakfast, push through hunger, burn fat faster, gain discipline. But the human body does not upgrade its operating system overnight. It doesn't respond to schedules the way apps do. It responds to signals, biological, hormonal, and neurological signals that have been reinforced for years, sometimes decades. So, when someone starts fasting and immediately feels hungry, tired, irritable, or mentally foggy, they assume something is wrong. They assume fasting is failing, or worse, that their body is broken. But in reality, what they are experiencing is not failure, it is transition. The human body is designed for survival, not for instant fat loss. For most modern adults, survival has meant constant access to food, frequent glucose spikes, irregular sleep, chronic stress, and emotional eating layered on top. Over time, the body adapts perfectly to that environment. It becomes efficient at burning glucose and cautious about releasing stored energy. So when food suddenly disappears, the body does not celebrate, it becomes alert. In the early stages of intermittent fasting, the body does not immediately burn fat. Its first priority is to preserve what feels familiar. It uses remaining glycogen, increases hunger hormones, and encourages you to eat again, not because you need fuel, but because your nervous system interprets unpredictability as risk. This is where one of the most damaging misconceptions takes root, the idea that metabolism has an on-off switch. That skipping meals automatically flips the body into fat-burning mode. That belief sounds logical, but biology doesn't work that way. The shift from burning glucose to burning fat is not a switch. It is a spectrum, and moving along that spectrum requires time, repetition, and stability. This ability is called metabolic flexibility, the body's capacity to switch between fuel sources efficiently. And like any biological skill, it depends on your starting point. Someone with stable blood sugar, good sleep, low stress, and healthy muscle mass will transition faster than someone with high insulin, visceral fat accumulation, sleep deprivation, or long-term stress exposure. Slower adaptation does not mean failure. It means your body has more recalibration to do. But most people never hear that. They see edited success stories that skip the uncomfortable phase. So when their own experience feels difficult, they assume they're doing something wrong and quit right when adaptation is beginning. This is why the first week of fasting is not about fat loss. It's about signal correction. Hunger in the early days is not a warning sign. It is information. It tells you that your body is still expecting glucose at certain times because it has been trained to expect it. Hunger hormones like ghrelin follow routines, not actual energy emergencies. When you don't eat at the expected time, ghrelin rises not because you're starving, but because your brain is checking whether the old pattern still applies. And here's the critical point most people miss. If you don't immediately respond to that hunger by eating, ghrelin naturally falls. Hunger comes in waves, not straight lines, and as the brain learns that food isn't arriving on the old schedule, those waves weaken. That is not starvation, that is learning. But fasting does not happen in isolation. This is another major misunderstanding. You cannot fast your way out of poor sleep, chronic stress, dehydration, or nutrient-poor meals. Fasting does not override lifestyle signals, it amplifies them. Sleep deprivation raises cortisol. Cortisol destabilizes blood sugar. Unstable blood sugar intensifies hunger and cravings, especially for quick carbohydrates. If you fast while underslept, hunger feels louder, not because fasting is wrong, but because your nervous system is already under strain. The same applies to hydration and electrolytes. When food intake drops, sodium, potassium, and magnesium intake often drops with it. Headaches, dizziness, fatigue, irritability, these are often blamed on fasting when they are actually signs of dehydration or mineral imbalance. Then there's what happens inside the eating window. If fasting is followed by ultra-processed food, sugar spikes, and low protein intake, the metabolic signal becomes chaotic. Insulin surges, blood sugar crashes. The next fast feels harder, not easier. Not because fasting failed, but because the recovery signal was poor. Fasting is not a magic fix. It is a biological mirror. It reveals how well or how poorly your body is currently regulated. This is why intermittent fasting should not be framed as a test of willpower. Willpower is not infinite. It is a neurological resource that drains under stress. Early fasting often exposes the limits of willpower rather than strengthening it. Real adaptation happens when the brain learns that delayed eating does not equal danger. That lesson requires consistency, not force. When fasting is approached as a structured learning process, supported by sleep, hydration, nutrient-dense meals, and realistic expectations, hunger quiets. Energy stabilizes. Mental clarity improves. Not because you became tougher, but because your internal environment changed. And that shift from fighting the body to retraining it is what determines whether someone quits after a few days or builds a sustainable metabolic foundation for years. One of the most seductive myths surrounding intermittent fasting is the idea that fasting will automatically make you more disciplined. That skipping meals somehow upgrades your willpower. That hunger becomes proof of strength. But neuroscience tells a very different story. In the early stages of fasting, willpower is not being built. It is being drained. The human brain evolved to prioritize energy stability above all else. For years, often decades, your brain has learned that glucose arrives frequently and predictably, that regular eating equals safety. So, when fasting begins and glucose availability drops, the brain does not interpret this as a health strategy. It interprets it as instability. And when the brain senses instability, it does not cooperate. It resists. That resistance shows up as familiar internal dialogue. Just a small snack won't hurt. I'll start again tomorrow. I'm too stressed today. Maybe this just isn't for me. These thoughts are not personal weakness. They are survival circuits, doing exactly what they were designed to do, restore what feels normal. This is why willpower often collapses during the first week of fasting. Not because you lack discipline, but because you are trying to override deeply wired biological programs with sheer force. Willpower is not an unlimited resource. It functions more like a neurological muscle. Every decision, every act of restraint, every stressor draws from the same pool. When fasting is layered on top of work stress, emotional strain, sleep deprivation, and social pressure, that pool drains rapidly. So when people say, "I failed because I wasn't strong enough," they are misdiagnosing the problem. The issue was not strength. It was timing and misunderstanding. True adaptation does not come from fighting hunger. It comes from teaching the brain that hunger is not dangerous. This is where hunger itself must be redefined. Since childhood, most of us were taught that hunger is an emergency, a sign of low blood sugar, a signal that something is wrong. Eat now or suffer consequences. But biologically, hunger is not a single signal. It is a combination of hormonal patterns, learned rhythms, and psychological cues. One of the key hormones involved is ghrelin. Ghrelin rises not because your body is out of energy, but because your brain expects food at a certain time. If breakfast always arrived at 8 a.m., ghrelin rises at 8 a.m., regardless of whether your energy stores are full. This is why hunger in early fasting feels urgent but fades if you don't react to it immediately. Ghrelin works in pulses, not a continuous climb. If you ride out the first 15 to 30 minutes of a hunger wave, it often subsides on its own. That moment is critical, because when you eat immediately, you reinforce the old signal. Hunger equals action. But when you don't, the brain receives new data. Hunger does not always require food. This is how hunger transforms from a command into information. And over several days, sometimes a week, the brain begins to rewire its hunger clock. The same time that once triggered intense hunger now passes quietly, not because you forced it, but because the expectation changed. This is why people who make it past the first week often report something surprising. They feel less hungry, not more. Not because their metabolism slowed, but because the brain stopped sending unnecessary alarms. However, hunger has another layer that confuses many people: emotional hunger. Emotional hunger does not originate in the stomach. It originates in the brain's reward system. When you feel stressed, bored, lonely, anxious, or emotionally depleted, dopamine pathways activate. And because food, especially sugar, salt, and fat, reliably increases dopamine, the brain learns a shortcut: eating equals relief. Over time, this creates a powerful association. Emotional discomfort begins to masquerade as physical hunger. Fasting exposes this pattern brutally. When eating is no longer available on demand, emotions that were once numbed by food rise to the surface. Anxiety, restlessness, irritability, even sadness. And the brain responds by generating cravings that feel identical to real hunger. This is why many beginners think fasting is making them worse. They feel hungrier, more emotional, more unstable. But what is actually happening is unmasking, not damage. Neuroscience shows that emotional hunger activates many of the same brain regions as physical hunger, including the hypothalamus and amygdala. That means the sensation feels real. But the cause is not energy deficit. It is emotional regulation seeking an outlet. This is where fasting becomes more than a dietary strategy. It becomes a diagnostic tool. When a craving hits, the question is no longer, how do I stop this? It becomes, what is my body actually asking for right now? Am I tired? Am I stressed? Am I avoiding something uncomfortable? Am I dehydrated? Am I seeking relief rather than fuel? The moment you name the true need, something remarkable often happens. The craving weakens, because the brain stops confusing feelings with fuel requirements. This is also why emotional awareness is not optional in successful fasting. It is foundational. Without it, fasting feels like punishment. With it, fasting becomes information. And that is the turning point most people never reach, not because they are incapable, but because they were taught to treat hunger as an enemy rather than a message. One of the most dangerous assumptions people make about intermittent fasting is the belief that not eating is enough. That fasting alone will override poor sleep, chronic stress, dehydration, and years of nutritional imbalance. It won't. Fasting does not operate in a vacuum. It operates as an amplifier. Whatever signals dominate your lifestyle, good or bad, fasting turns up the volume. This is why two people can follow the same fasting schedule and have completely different experiences. One feels calm, clear, and energized. The other feels shaky, irritable, and exhausted. The difference is not willpower, it is physiology. Let's start with sleep. Sleep is the foundation of metabolic regulation. When sleep is insufficient or irregular, cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, rises. Elevated cortisol destabilizes blood sugar by increasing glucose output from the liver and reducing insulin sensitivity. That creates rapid blood sugar swings. When blood sugar becomes unstable, hunger becomes louder, cravings intensify, mental focus declines, and when fasting is layered on top of that instability, the discomfort feels extreme. Many people blame fasting when the real problem is sleep deprivation. If you sleep fewer than 6 hours a night, fasting will feel harder. Not because fasting is harmful, but because your nervous system is already operating in a stressed state. The brain interprets fasting as an additional threat rather than a controlled signal. Now add chronic stress. Psychological stress activates the same hormonal pathways as physical danger. Cortisol rises, adrenaline follows. The body prioritizes immediate energy availability. Fat storage increases, especially around the abdomen, because visceral fat acts as a rapid access energy reserve under perceived threat. This means that fasting while chronically stressed can paradoxically stall fat loss. Not because fasting is ineffective, but because the body does not release stored energy when it feels unsafe. The body releases fat when it senses stability, not pressure. This is why aggressive fasting combined with high stress often backfires. Hunger feels unbearable, energy crashes, sleep worsens. And people conclude that fasting doesn't work for them, when in reality, their internal environment is not supportive of adaptation. Hydration and electrolytes are the next overlooked pillar. When you eat less frequently, you don't just reduce calories. You also reduce sodium, potassium, and magnesium intake, minerals that regulate nerve signaling, muscle contraction, blood pressure, and energy metabolism. Early fasting often triggers increased sodium excretion through the kidneys. If electrolytes are not replenished, symptoms appear quickly: headaches, dizziness, fatigue, brain fog, irritability, even heart palpitations. These symptoms are often mislabeled as fasting side effects. In reality, they are electrolyte imbalances. Proper hydration is not optional during fasting. It is essential. Water alone is not always enough. Sodium supports blood volume. Potassium stabilizes nerve impulses. Magnesium calms the nervous system. Without them, fasting feels unnecessarily harsh. Now let's address what happens when the fast ends. The eating window is not a free-for-all. It is a signaling window. What you eat after fasting sends powerful metabolic instructions. Meals high in refined carbohydrates and low in protein cause rapid glucose spikes, followed by crashes. Insulin surges. Hunger returns quickly. The next fast feels harder. In contrast, meals built around protein, fiber, healthy fats, and micronutrients stabilize blood sugar for hours. Insulin rises gently. Satiety hormones increase. The next fasting window feels easier, not harder. This is why fasting success is not defined by how long you avoid food, but by how well you recover. Fasting exposes dietary weaknesses brutally. Poor meal quality becomes obvious. Nutrient gaps become loud. Blood sugar instability becomes impossible to ignore. This is not a failure of fasting, it is feedback. Fasting reveals whether your lifestyle is supportive or hostile to metabolic health. And this is why intermittent fasting should never be framed as a punishment or test of endurance. It is a diagnostic process. If fasting feels chaotic, the solution is not to push harder. It is to stabilize the system. Improve sleep consistency, reduce unnecessary stress, hydrate intentionally, replenish electrolytes, eat meals that support hormonal balance. When those pillars align, fasting stops feeling like deprivation. Hunger quiets, energy smooths out, mental clarity improves. Not because fasting is magical, but because the body finally feels safe enough to let go. One of the fastest ways people lose trust in intermittent fasting is by comparing timelines. Someone else feels lighter in 3 days. Someone else reports instant mental clarity. Meanwhile, you feel tired, unfocused, and frustrated. And the conclusion forms quietly. This doesn't work for me. But fat adaptation is not a universal schedule. It is an individualized biological process. To access stored fat efficiently, the body must lower insulin, stabilize blood sugar, and upregulate pathways that convert fat into usable energy. That transition does not happen at the same speed for everyone. It depends on insulin sensitivity, visceral fat levels, sleep quality, stress load, muscle mass, age, hormonal status, and metabolic history. If insulin remains elevated due to stress, poor sleep, or highly refined carbohydrates, fat stores stay biologically locked. Even during fasting, the body may struggle to access them. This creates the uncomfortable low-energy zone many beginners experience. Glucose is low, fat burning is not fully online yet, and ketone production has not stabilized. This state feels like failure, but it is actually a bridge. The mistake is assuming faster adaptation equals better outcomes. In biology, rushed transitions often create instability. Slow, consistent adaptation produces resilience. This principle becomes especially important when exercise enters the picture. Many people believe fasting requires harder workouts, that exercising intensely on an empty stomach will accelerate fat loss. In early fasting, this often backfires. High-intensity training relies heavily on glucose. When glucose availability is low and fat adaptation is incomplete, performance drops. Dizziness, shakiness, nausea, and fatigue appear. The body interprets this as threat, not progress. This does not mean exercise and fasting are incompatible. It means timing and intensity matter. In the early adaptation phase, low-intensity movement is most supportive. Brisk walking, light resistance training, mobility work, cycling at a steady pace. These activities improve insulin sensitivity without overwhelming the nervous system. They gently encourage fat utilization without triggering stress responses. Research shows that light fasted movement can increase fat oxidation by 20–30% compared to post-meal exercise. Not because it is harder, but because it is metabolically aligned. As adaptation improves, often after 2 to 3 weeks, intensity can gradually increase. Strength training before the first meal. Moderate cardio at the end of the fasting window. Occasional higher intensity sessions once energy stability is established. The key principle is this: exercise should support fasting, not compete with it. Now zoom out to the long term. The most damaging mistake people make with intermittent fasting is treating it as a race. Shrinking eating windows aggressively, chasing extreme schedules, measuring success only by the scale. When pressure increases, cortisol rises. When cortisol rises, fat loss stalls, especially visceral fat. The body does not release energy under pressure, it releases energy under perceived safety. This is why fasting often starts working before weight changes appear. Mental clarity improves. Hunger stabilizes. Digestion feels calmer. Evening cravings fade. These are not side effects. They are adaptation signals. When people ignore these signals and focus only on rapid weight loss, they push harder, they eat less, sleep worse, train more aggressively, and the system collapses. Sustainable fasting is not about eating less. It is about eating at the right time, with the right composition, in a body that feels regulated. This is also where purpose matters. Without a clear reason beyond the scale, fasting becomes fragile. Every hunger wave feels like punishment. Every low-energy day feels like failure. Quitting becomes easy. But when fasting is anchored to deeper goals, better sleep, stable energy, freedom from emotional eating, metabolic health, discomfort becomes data, not defeat. Fasting becomes a conversation with the body instead of a battle against it. And that is the shift that changes everything. Because the goal of intermittent fasting is not to dominate hunger. It is to understand it, not to override biology, but to cooperate with it. When approached with patience, clarity, and respect for individual biology, fasting becomes sustainable. Not perfect, not extreme, but effective. You stop chasing timelines, you stop comparing, you start listening. And over time, the body responds not with chaos, but with trust.